Hey, good evening, good afternoon. Whenever you happenstance upon this truth bomb riff from Patrick Lovell, it is currently June 24th, 2023 at approximately 5:40 p.m. my time on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. But I want to continue with this sort of sentiment to try to build momentum in a way that I think makes complete sense to me and is a corollary and parallel to what I've been dropping on Twitter recently and engaging a bunch of different groups. But I thought that tonight was an interesting opportunity to comment on what appears to be, I don't know, chaos to a degree regarding Russia's blunder and what it reveals. So, unless you're living under a rock, you probably didn't see that last night that a general, I guess he's a general, he's referred to in the New York Times as Mr. So, I guess because he's a private contractor of a group of mercenaries called the Wagner Group. It's very confusing. The Wagner Group is led by a I guess, some sort of general, but I guess he just reminds me of a character that you would see in like a Marvel comic fantasy sort of outlandish diabolical villain sort of scenario. Although what I'm going to get to, might contradict that slightly. But there's this guy by the name of Prigozhin. Now I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm not Russian, obviously, although I do have some Ukrainian descent. But I have a hard time pronouncing Russian names. But this guy, apparently yesterday, he and his Wagner group involved with, I guess, whatever version of combat they're in the midst of within Ukraine, were being shot at, in his words, Mr. Prigozhin's words, by Russian forces in the back while they slept, enough to make this guy gather, I think, his 25,000 mercenaries that I now understand he was able to recruit from prisons. And again, like any Marvel comic, and I watch a lot of these, sort of superhero films with my son who's 18 years old, and we're both big fans. But it's like escape from some Russian prisons that were turned into these mercenaries that are really rough and tumble fighters, but they're on the front lines in Ukraine and they suddenly get shot at from behind, and they're all mercenaries. They're privately paid. It's not revealed exactly who's paying them in the network, but the way I think the relationship with Vladimir Putin worked is this guy Prigozhin basically was arrested and he was in prison during the transition to Putin initially in the late 90s. And they befriended one another. I guess Prigozhin was literally got out of prison and was selling hot dogs in Moscow. And somehow he hustled up a relationship with Putin. And, over the course of the last, I guess, probably 25 years, got into a position. I know that he became like this chef for Putin, and he was involved with all sorts of strange things. And then suddenly he became a billionaire, and then he's heading up the Wagner Group, which reminds me of the Golden Company in Game of Thrones, or probably like Blackwater, which is our version of some really organized and rough and tumble mercenaries led by Eric Prince, the billionaire, and his sister, of course, who was in the Trump administration, whose name eludes me at the moment, Becky DeVos. God, she was a mess. I think she was like Secretary of Education, which was a complete joke. And I think their family made billions in vitamins and some sort of multi-level networking sort of thing. And which is peculiar, but I've always had kind of an eye on Eric Prince since after 9/11 and what Blackwater did in Iraq and their relationships with all of the Middle Eastern countries, and then potentially what BlackRock might have been involved with here with a lot of billionaire right-wing Republican funders, especially during the insurrection that our country hasn't unpacked. But meanwhile, this guy Prigozhin decides to turn his forces around last night and aim them at Moscow. And they were marching, and they were met, I guess, kind of like liberators in a sense. And then ultimately, as it stands at the moment, it looks to me like that the Kremlin and Putin and whoever was involved somehow had talks with Prigozhin and decided to drop any sorts of charges of treason to the mercenaries that, of course, came out of prisons that are working for this privately funded Wagner group that were on the front lines of Ukraine, that were getting shot at their back, according to Prigozhin, and in their sleep as they turned back towards Moscow. And I guess really the big hoopla outside of the revelation of, like, for someone like myself who grew up during the Cold War, looking at it like, this is the Soviet Union? I mean, I've known that Russia is obviously quite a bit different than what ultimately the Soviet Union was throughout the Cold War, and of course after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I've been, I guess, in my own profession and in my own sort of network, I have close personal friends that have worked with Russians for years in Hollywood, and Russians have been taking money out of Russia and laundering it into all sorts of Western investments, and one of which is Hollywood. In fact, Steven Mnuchin, I can tell you, has worked closely with Russian oligarchs, and I probably wouldn't be surprised if at some point he made some movie with Prigozhin money. Who knows? Kind of intriguing and weird stuff. But it's like, guys, I mean, what the New York Times was saying was that the big concern for NATO and all of the Western commanders and anybody who understands, I guess, the inside pool of whatever Russia's military fiasco is at the moment, is a significant concern over potentially a civil war with nuclear weapons and what that could potentially lead to. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this is chaos. So I looked at some of the civilian casualty numbers for both the Ukrainians and the Russians, and they're right about the same. I mean, they're monumental losses on both sides. The Russians, I think, have lost between 200 and 300,000 soldiers. Compare that to America and Vietnam, considering all of the upheaval in the United States at that time, we lost 57,000 troops. Now, there were 4.5 million Vietnamese that died in that conflict, which is obviously significant. And in this particular, at least to date, the numbers that I've seen, I don't know how accurate they are, but it looks like they're 200 to 300,000 losses on the Ukrainian side as well. Typically, you always find that countries that have been invaded, withstand a lot more losses. And you think back to World War II and just the tremendous sacrifice of the Russians against the Germans. I know that the Russians lost something like 20 million in that particular theater, and they had already lost 20 million before that during the Revolution and the famine and all of that sort of thing. So, I guess Russians, and I've read a little bit of Dostoevsky and some of the great Russian literature, and they have a tendency to be able to absorb incredibly horrific pain. I'm not laughing. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of these characters that you see in some of these movies that, come out of prison cells, and they're, completely brutal because they've been brutalized, sort of thing. And that's kind of my imagery with this whole thing. And, but you look at it in context to what it is that I'm trying to do with our effort. And I want to read this quote that I read from Prigozhin that ended up in the front page of the New York Times. And I found it interesting because he's been on record a bunch because he's had a feud with the Russian generals who he calls unqualified scoundrels and intrigants. He has contrasted that with what he sees as the decadence of the Russian elites and injustice in Russian society. He says, quote, "The children of the elite smear themselves with creams, showing it on the internet. Ordinary people's children come in zinc, torn to pieces," he said, referring to the coffins of dead soldiers and adding that those killed in action had tens of thousands of relatives die, and society always demands justice. And he went on to say, and if there is no justice, then revolution is inevitable. It's chaos. I personally, the bloodshed that, I thought the Vietnam War for the United States was insane, considering all of the upheaval that, basically surrounded my youth. And again, 57,000 troops compared to 200, 300,000 troops. And that's in a year. So things are splintering and crazy in Russia, and God only knows what the outcome is going to be. I guess they've somehow gotten Prigozhin to go the other direction. He's going to Belarus, and he's not going to be subject to some criminal proceedings, and he's a free man, as is his Wagner company. It's like, hey guys, we'll hire you at a later date. Let's just deal with things that are in front of us. And I don't know, chaos. This is not the superpower of Brezhnev and Stalin all the way through, and Khrushchev, and 13 days in Cuba, and the Cold War, and the nuclear warheads, and mutually assured destruction. I mean, this is chaos, and it's chaos because. And I happened to respond to this last night in something on Twitter. I think I made a comment, and I got a lot of attention and action on this because someone had mentioned that Russia is a failed state and it's completely corrupt, and all they do is they launder ill-gotten gains or money that they're pulling out of resources in Russia, and they basically throw them into London and the United States, and to, of course, real estate, the intersection of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Yeah, that's been going on for several decades. And again, to all of those who find themselves saying there's nothing to see here with Russiagate because they hang their hat on the Steele dossier, it's just absurd. But the fact that Putin is in this peculiar scenario with, I don't know, a splinter group, that he doesn't have control over. I mean, it's basically a failed state with nukes, with a lot of insane corruption, and then a lot of suffering, and people, being thrown into the war machine, and then ultimately expendable, so that Putin can have more territory, or in either case, however you want to argue it. I know there's a lot of people that are like, yeah, the United States shouldn't be providing military assistance to the Ukraine, and I see a lot of numbers that are completely confangled and not accurate in terms of what our actual level of commitment to the Ukraine is, but it's still way too much for many. And there's a lot of questionable relationships along those lines, and it's definitely sunk into the presidential campaign between, especially with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and those of that ilk. And again, I have always felt, to kind of close this up and transition to what it is that I think is relevant from this whole thing, from where I'm coming from, is the war could splinter out of control. It's been a massive concern for over a year now. I can't believe it's been over a year. It just seems like it was yesterday when all of this happened. But at the same time, it's definitely going to another level. But the mechanics and all of the undercurrents and what's on display doesn't seem like it's that sort of as bizarre a world as it is, considering my sort of perception of Russia and the organization of the Red Army and the superpower that it was, versus everything post 1998 Russia, which shows this state in turmoil. That's not the massive superpower threat that it once was. That's not to say it's not dangerous. Of course, Russia is dangerous, but it's not the cohesive empire that it once was. And I say that in context to what Prigozhin said regarding a failed society and justice, that a society demands justice. And then ultimately, when you look at the United States, you kind of wonder to yourself, well, wait a second, how far behind are we from something this insane? And, and I mentioned on this Twitter thread last night, I was like, yeah, Russia is a failed state and everything that you've said is true. But what I know and what my work has led me to reveal to, I hope, eventually millions upon millions of Americans, is we're that corrupt and more. Except the difference is we have insane leverage because we have the world's reserve currency. We're the global reserve system, and with the Federal Reserve. And yet the American people, many of whom are suffering greatly and have been for the course of the last 14 years as a result of the 2008 great financial crisis. And many have done very well because of what I'm about to say. But the percentage of people that have done well versus the people who have been struggling and feeling, incredible misery and so on and so forth. And in America, we don't understand our system. We don't understand anything about power in this country. Now, last night I was paying attention. It was driving me nuts. And I kind of went a little bit overboard on Twitter, but I'm not really pulling anything back because there is no time to pull anything back. So I was switching back and forth between CNN and MSNBC and every once in a while Fox just to see what they were saying about things. And I caught mostly from MSNBC a few things that just absolutely drove me insane. The first was, of course, there was a big to-do about whether or not the Department of Justice in the United States is going to bring massive investigations and further indictments about Donald Trump's usage of fake electors in the insurrection and all things that surrounded the 2020 election. And meanwhile, they're focusing on 7 states and these electors who used illegal documentation fabrication to try to swing the Electoral College in the direction for Trump, who was trying to pull a coup d'etat. And whether or not it was Trump's brainchild and how far down the path he got with his own vision, my gut tells me Trump was just basically an actor. They said, dude, this is Wag the Dog, Donald, and we're going to tell you what to say and we're going to write the script for you. Let us handle the rest. That's my theory. I honestly think it was the billionaires, like all the apparatus involved with Sheldon Adelson's, the late Sheldon Adelson's billionaire funded, conservative groups alongside the Mercers and the Koch brothers and that whole network hive of, this version's, dark money allegiance to this sort of Confederate overthrow of the United States is the way I look at it. And I think at the front of that, I think all of these were basically the brainchild myself. I think it was Steve Bannon. And I think his involvement, particularly with Eric Mercer, and what I saw forthwith from William Barr, who was our Attorney General at the time, we saw unmarked, special ops guys in the streets of Portland and Wisconsin that jumped out of vans in our country. These guys were probably returned mercenaries, I think, from the likes of Blackwater that were, basically driving into Black Lives Matters riots and Antifa, and that's the way it was positioned, riots at the time, and literally just grabbing people off the street and shoving them in vans, which is what they do in other countries and have with the CIA for decades. We've got many clandestine black ops types of operations, and they came home, okay? So that in its own right, with the insurrection, really, again, illustrates that as crazy as Prigozhin last night turning a group of mercenaries in the Wagner Group against Putin, a crazed, freaking lunatic, money laundering criminal oligarch that has basically extracted the wealth of Russia and laundered it all over the West, in addition to everything else he is. It's just absolute chaos. Again, what I'm trying to emulate here is that, or parallel, is that the insurrection has a lot of similarities, quite frankly. Not at the same level, but similarities nonetheless. And, as I'm listening to the analysis about the electoral certification fraud and the big to-do, particularly from MSNBC, because Rachel Maddow is pushing the level of trying to pressure the Department of Justice because they've sat on these, what she is referring to, and I think she thinks that she created criminal referrals to the Justice Department for these 7 scenarios. That looks to me like racketeering. It looks to me like Rudolph Giuliani was the chief guy involved with the electoral certification fraud. But at the same time, and I hope they take the whole thing down under RICO statutes, but at the same time, what I've been showing you and what I've been appealing to you and trying to get your information and your interest to understand is that we, the team that I've aggregated and the people I've talked to all over the United States and the information I've got both on my shelves and also in podcasts that I've done and also, microdocs that we've shown you, we are aware of literally tens of millions of pieces of documentation fraud and illegal foreclosures that illegally foreclosed on millions of Americans. Now, you've got to understand something. I think a lot of people have this perception that, look, Patrick, the people that got booted from their houses didn't pay their mortgage. Nobody's getting a free house. They got what they deserved. That's not what happened. Not exactly. What really happened was people got set up in fraudulent loans that they didn't understand, that had certain specificity, that turned the table on people that didn't understand what they were getting into, such that the people that were writing the loans stroked them a bill of goods. Did they get their money to refinance? Yeah. Based on terms that were dealing with, all sorts of manner of shape of deceptive acts and practices that people didn't understand, so that when things went sideways, they started getting themselves in a pickle that they couldn't get out of, because we had adjustable rate loans where suddenly loans were like this. And you might say, okay, well, what about caveat emptor? They didn't read the contract. They took the money. They're idiots. Okay, there's that. But you can't lie on documentation. You can't misrepresent what you're doing based on civil rights laws, which brokers were incentivized to do to the tune of tens of millions. That created what we call liar's loans, that got to the point that were so ridiculous that, for example, tomato pickers that were recent immigrants in the United States were able to qualify for houses that were valued at $700,000. That happened. Not in one case, in many, many cases, probably tens of thousands of cases. Now, those are extreme, but everything else from there, a lot of variations of that. And I don't want to go through every single one of them at the same time, but they were all placed into securities that were then sold into derivatives. And we created $600 trillion of derivatives trades, $800 trillion by the time we got to 2006. And we blew up the world because it was all built on fucking sawdust, because a tomato picker who just came over from Mexico, who's working at I don't know what wages, cannot afford a $700,000 house that a broker put him into because he lied to him about the documents, and then he presented Spanish documents, and then he made him sign documents that, created all the lying, deceptive acts and practices in English. That was a thing. And that was one of millions of scenarios that took place. And, it goes on and on and on. I mean, negative amortization and, all of these different ways that you could, take out these loans, and people buy it and refinance their houses and borrowed until it was like, wait a second, now I got to pay, 100% more than what my note was for the last 3 years. And I don't have that kind of money. My salary didn't increase. Oh, sorry, refinance because your house has increased over the course of time. Oh, wow, I can refinance? Now I can buy that boat. Yeah, a lot of people did that, and they did use their houses as ATMs, but built on the deceptive acts and practices that brokers were getting to lie on illegal loan documentations that created illegal securities that everybody in the pipeline knew was going to blow up. How do I know that? Well, among others, Goldman Sachs knew exactly what they were putting into these securities, in so much that I've got evidence that both in Jacksonville, Florida, and Seattle, Washington, they had criminals, just like I talked about at the outset, Brigozhev, or whatever his name is. I'll go back to his name in a minute. Sorry if I butchered it. But they got criminals out of prison to be mercenaries in this Wagner group in Russia. What we did here is we got guys that had been in prison. They came out, and then they were taught off a script how to sell people liar's loans, especially people that were minorities. That's one of many pieces of evidence that I have on the shelf that I can't get out there, because the machine, the Borg that nobody understands, that's in complete control, which is our financial system, that can do every bit as illegal grift and laundering as Vladimir Putin, but it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States because of the incredible power that our currency has as the global reserve currency, among other things. Which, by the way, we got that because we won World War II, because we were a superpower, an incredibly innovative country that had incredible capacity and capabilities to do what no other nation on earth ever did, and did until we ended up sabotaging ourselves with incredible betrayal from the biggest asshole buffoon con artist in the history of the world. And I'm not just talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about the CEOs on Wall Street that created everything that I'm talking about through perverse incentives because of what we call modern executive compensation, which they're paid by. And so throughout this entire grift in the United States, our guys, they ended up creating 600 to 800 trillion dollars worth of phony securities and derivatives that they blew up on the world. And I didn't finish this about Goldman Sachs. Yes, the Big Short that was done by Brad Pitt's Plan B, and of course, the Adam McKay, who I love, is a fantastic comedic writer. They didn't understand what they were dealing with. So, for example, the idea in the Big Short, if you happen to watch that movie, was that the strip dancer was in over her head and like pulling one over on the brokers and buying too much real estate that she fancied herself some sort of financial expert. And, she's a strip dancer. And she's talking about her, her portfolio, like she's a money manager sort of thing. Meanwhile, the idea that Adam McKay was representing that this is what we were doing is we were, allowing, strip dancers and pole dancers to basically con Wall Street. In what world do you think that's possible? No, it was the brokers that were setting up the pole dancers because they were all getting paid fees, which are commissions on liars' loans. So they set the whole world up. And by the way, why were they able to do this? Because at this time period, between 2001, 2005, because the United States, through our neoliberalism and our NAFTA, basically offshored and outsourced the middle class and the golden goose, or the golden egg of the economy, which is our manufacturing. Over the course of 4 or 5 decades, we shopped it off to Asia. We got most of our energy from the Middle East, and we were a nation of middlemen that hollowed out the middle class. So we weren't a consumption class, but the world didn't know that. So all of the people that were like new middle class people with more money than they had before could invest, and they invested in our mortgage-backed securities that were made up of liars' loans. And so, for example, Goldman Sachs, because everybody on Wall Street said, oh, wow, those guys really are sharp and clever because they were ahead of the game. Meanwhile, they set the whole game up because they set the fucking timer on the nuclear grenade that blew up the world, and they were the total Big Short. And I'll put it into this context. So, for example, the actual storyline of the Big Short involved Michael Burry and his hedge fund, and the real numbers that Burry made for his hedge fund was $500 million. Yes, it was a great calculated bet based on doing research and figuring things out, and then having the Constitution and the patience to be able to ride it all out until the entire, housing market collapsed. And the way that they frame it in The Big Short was like, look, that's capitalism. These guys did their research. They knew what they were going to do. And so how can we hold that against them? And so they made out like bandits because of the nature of the way shorts work. Okay, fine. We'll just, leave it at that. And I'm not going to, be critical of Michael Burry or Adam McKay or Brad Pitt. But what I'm going to try to manage to maneuver you to understand is that in context to $500 million short gain for the hedge fund that the real life character Michael Burry created, and it was Christian Bale who played his role. He was at the drums and he listened to Metallica, one of the greatest performances ever. But just to kind of keep it, for those of you who don't know all of the references that I'm revealing to you, he ultimately, like I said, $498 billion, $500 million. So Goldman literally worked with a guy by the name of John Paulson. John Paulson, not to be confused with, at the time, Hank Paulson, who was the head of the U.S. Treasury, who actually was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. And in this particular case, John Paulson and his lieutenant, a guy by the name of Paolo Pellegrini, they started figuring things out, like what was presented in The Big Short. And they ultimately went out and they did the research and they figured out, like down in Orange County, that some like Ken doll, surfer dude with with like, I don't know, an undergraduate degree is making millions of dollars and driving his convertible BMW in Orange County based on liar's loans. And they figured the whole thing out, right? Okay, but they figured out a lot more than that, because what happened between about 2004, 2006, 2007, all of these major investment banks ended up buying the verticals of these retail banks that were the likes of Countrywide, and in the case of what I'm revealing to you with regards to Goldman Sachs was an operation called Greenpoint. And Greenpoint, and we have this in our work, The Con, at www.thecon.tv, basically we have the ultimate whistleblower who was a previous professional that was there to do all of the underwriting to make sure that they wouldn't get their investors in a bind by lending out money to people who didn't qualify to get loans. But the way it worked with all of these companies, and they became pretender lenders, is that they were incentivized to actually get as many loans approved in the pipeline as quickly as possible so that they got rid of all of the underwriting standards, which is part of the stopgap, which makes all of the housing value real. Because you would imagine, just like an airplane, all of the mechanics and the symmetry of the aerodynamics and the engines and the computers and so forth have to work in unison to be able to make that plane fly. Same thing with the value of real estate, but in this case, everything was being set up to fail. And so Greenpoint, which was owned by Goldman Sachs, ultimately was creating as many liar's loans as they possibly could because Paolo Pellegrini and John Paulson were handpicking the worst of the worst loans, like the tomato picker in California that was living in a $700,000 house. They were handpicking those and putting those into these securities and these bonds and then trust, and then they shorted against them because they knew exactly when they were going to blow up. They did that before the whole market blew up, and they also knew that AIG was, think about it as liar's poker, quite frankly. Everybody is supposed to be holding, all of the right cards because of the way management and regulation and the way our system is supposed to work so that everybody knows that the system is worth investing in. But what happened in the run-up to the 2008 great financial crisis and collapse is that everybody was lying. And so, for example, AIG, the largest insurer in the world, they didn't have any buffer on the insurance that they were selling, and they were just pocketing it for their CEOs so that there was no product that could withstand a massive cataclysmic downturn in the housing market. And Goldman Sachs knew it. So they called AIG's bluff, and that created the domino, which we call House of Cards, which literally happened in 2007 based on Bear Stearns and other things that then led us to the ultimate eureka, where the 13 banks came together with Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, who was the Treasury, head of the Federal Reserve, and then of course Timothy Geithner, who was the head of the New York Federal Reserve, and then ultimately became the Secretary of the Treasury under Obama. They met privately behind the scenes with the top 13 bankers, and everybody knew that there was going to be a massive systemic run because of the nature of this fraudulent pipeline of securities that they sold on the world. And then ultimately what happened was they, meaning the government, basically said, okay, here's a 3-page piece of paper. You're going to do what we tell you. And they knew that shit was going to run. And that's when they set up, through the Federal Reserve, initially what was called Maiden Lane, which was this scenario where they were providing emergency lending from the government, apparently through the big banks, that ultimately make it look through a PR sort of job that the banks were coming together to save Wall Street. Meanwhile, it was the government through the Federal Reserve that was piping trillions of dollars because we've got the ability to do that because we're the world's reserve currency and everybody's betting and buying our securities and our bonds and everything else, which is what gives the dollar value. And ultimately, they were working a backdoor deal from the very beginning that BlackRock was put in position to actually manage. That was actually 6 months before the fall of Lehman that then eventually would lead to what I continue to reveal to you all. In 2009, the Federal Reserve pumped $29 trillion into a racketeering enterprise that blew up the world, where every CEO was guilty of racketeering and control fraud, should have gone to jail and prison and had all of their bonuses and their money ripped from them. The banks should have been nationalized, and we should have cleaned up the rot of corruption at that time, which was financial terrorism that would go on to ultimately bury illegally, because the illegal documentation fraud that I told you, which is financial fraud, terrorism, that led to burying tens of millions of Americans illegally. And to this day, nobody knows what's going on. To this day, what you end up seeing is this chaos between MAGA and all of these, bloviating white people, especially, I've seen recently these videos of these MAGA women that are just nauseating and just yelling, and they don't have any idea what the world is that they live in. And especially all of these MAGAs are anti-socialism. Meanwhile, they don't realize that socialism is what saved the financial system that's paying Air Donald and as well as everybody else in the pipeline and our financial system. And meanwhile, they all got blown up like everybody else. And so it creates chaos. And so this is corruption on a monumental scale that I always say corruption births and fuels fascism. Now, ultimately, and I'll close it up with this, in addition to the documentation fraud that MSNBC was like going apeshit about in the case of 7 cases, when I've got access to literally millions of documentation fraud, that is continuing on at this very moment. A courageous defense attorney by the name of Bruce Jacobs is about to have his bar license pulled because they corrupt Ron DeSantis, Supreme Court, and the judiciary of the Third Appellate Court in Florida are all in on it, working for Bank of America that blew up 2 billion pieces of documentation fraud that prove all this shit. They're all in on stealing the houses. And meanwhile, most Americans are fighting each other, just like we're seeing in Russia, as opposed to the guys that are responsible for this whole thing. And there's more. And I guess, I heard it last night a couple of times where, on MSNBC as well, they continue to go back to what I'm very curious is going to happen in Georgia with Fani Willis regarding racketeering. Once again, with the insurrection, or I should say with, stealing the election and vote counts and all of that other sort of maneuvering of what Trump was involved with Giuliani and everything else, which they're looking at as a racketeering enterprise, which it was. But again, Donald Trump, as big as he got with an insurrection in any type of time period in the United States, would be huge. But in comparison to what I'm talking about is literally nothing to the volume. It's a consequence of what it is that I'm explaining to you. And so ultimately, as this guy Prigozhin said, again, I'm going to remind everybody, society always demands justice. And if there is no justice, then revolution is inevitable. I've got no, favorite in that conflict. I kind of hope they take each other down, and hopefully Russia reinvents itself after the fact. And I hope we see it with that nuclear holocaust and some sort of bloodshed. But it's a little bit scary. When you think about World War I, for example, it was a hair trigger with a bunch of craziness that happened after, everybody's probably thinking about it. But when, what's his name got shot? Franz Ferdinand, right? So that triggered World War I, and it ended up 60 to 80 million people got killed. World War II seems to make a lot more sense chronologically of what led to what and cause and effect. But World War I was just kind of like what am I trying to say? It's like a barrel of dynamite with the fuse lit, and it just cascaded and dominoed, and it was like in a warehouse full of other, kegs filled with dynamite, right? And it just created a worldwide contagion. We might be in the midst of something like that now. Or maybe it's everybody for themselves and every country has a civil war, and we'll see what happens on the other side of this. But at the end, we've been under the thumb of corruption for at least 2 decades. That is out of control. Everything I just told you about was known by the Department of Justice. Everything I've been telling you about is known by the Federal Bureau of Investigations. How do I know? Because I made the con. It's available for another few days until June 30th, and then it's whitewashed from history, which is the $29 trillion truth that has all of the answers, and I have more answers. But at the end, I'm trying to tell you that billionaires spend billions to grift trillions, and they've completely perverted this country. We live in a modern day feudalism. It could be a techno feudalism because of the technology that's involved, but it's financial fraud and terrorism. And I always call it a corporate fascist state undergirded by a criminal syndicate that uses socialism to guarantee the mafiocracy with the full faith and credit of the United States that is now leading to fascism. Have you had enough chaos yet? Did you follow the bouncing ball? Do you understand who I am in this whole thing? I'm a guy with the truth. I'm a guy with the relationships and the evidence that can turn this thing upside down, inside out, and throw all of the bad guys and bulldoze corruption and send them into the fucking landfill where they belong, long before a massive revolution that takes out millions of people to see whatever comes out happens if you put your faith in me. But you've got to understand, it's not about me. It's you plus me equals we, the people. Do you want to live in a country that has the rule of law that can hold power to account? Because we're not that. We have a massive pandemic of corruption because the financial system operates with impunity and nobody understands what I'm telling you because the mainstream media gets paid to make sure you don't understand this. So whether it's Anderson Cooper, who gets paid like 13, 14 million a year, and he's got it, probably worth hundreds of millions because his last name's Vanderbilt. And you've got, Rachel Maddow, who gets paid $30 million a year to do great work if you really think the world depends on Donald Trump being taken down. He's one piece of the puzzle, but a small piece of the puzzle, to be honest with you. And then, then the likes of, I don't know, you see somebody like Tucker Carlson get 80 million views for what? Basically inferences, and then talking about what people are looking into, whether it's UFOs or pharmaceutical stuff, and everybody's kind of on the zeitgeist of what everybody else is saying, but nobody's telling you anything. None of the presidential candidates are giving you the level of detail that I have access to, that I continue to reveal to you. But at the end of the day, no one is going to tell you what I'm telling you. It's insane. You have no idea what we should be doing with a country of the incredible capacity and capability and intelligence and genius of the United States if we weren't corrupt beyond comprehension. Now you might say, okay, you know what? It's over there. It's Russia. I don't know what year it is, and I don't know anything that happened in the past. I'm just coming up in the world now, and I watch movies in my phone, and I think that everything's going to be okay because I'm going to go get my job, and I'm going to start my family, and everything is going to go the way it needs to go. No. You're playing roulette with yourself, man. We're at end of days. This thing has been going on for decades, man. And it's not going to get better until we, the people, rise, roar, and revolt, because failure is not an option. You've got to sack up, and you got to understand that if you invest in me and together we come together, that if you, me, and everyone you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in dignity, decency, integrity, most of all, liberty and sustainability, if we merge in unity, we will defeat and triumph over the tyranny of misery. This is all insane. This is history. This is so easy to tackle and to destroy, but we need millions to uplift the truth. We need millions to talk about liberty and justice for all. And we need millions to look at our politicians and our journalists and go, you lie. You have no credibility. Patrick Lovell, this guy that came out of nowhere, has got all the goddamn answers that you guys have hidden from us, and he's got the access to all the people in power that could turn this thing upside down, inside out, if we could have a critical mass of a populist tidal wave to crusade to purge corruption. Hey, it's Saturday. Thank you for listening. I really hope you'll join. $13 from 1,300 of you gives us 19,900. We can continue these podcasts. Take a look at Patrick Lovell, Truth Bombs the Con. I just did a fabulous podcast with William K. Black and Michael Hudson 2 days ago. I think it's been seen by over 500 people now, or 500 views. And some of the revelations in that are magnificent. And that's part and parcel to what we have to do. And I'm giving that to you as an example of what we need to do, because I can provide truths that nobody in mainstream media is going to give you, that nobody in print media is going to give you, that nobody anywhere is going to give you. Why? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. I think it's just because everybody gets paid to do what they're supposed to do, and they do it, and they don't ask questions. And that's not how journalism and democracy is supposed to work. If you don't ask questions and you don't know how things go on, you wound up like Nazi Germany, or you wind up like Russia now, which is a hotbed of fucking disaster. And it's going to probably get worse, I would imagine. I have no idea. Your guess is as good as mine, but whatever happens around this world, it's all symptomatic of massive corruption. The United States cannot do this. It's inconceivable. We're better than that. We have to fight for our democracy. We have to fight for our country. It's up to us. This is our generation's challenge and greatest challenge. And we can rise to the moment. We can. We've got the answers. there's millions of us out there that I know equipped with the truth will purge tyranny and will create the clean new deal. Thanks for listening. Please contribute today. Onwards and upwards.